pleasure to speak to this group, and always an honor to speak to this group. My screen share going here. Okay. For longer talks like this, I've started giving the take-home message right away so you can kind of see where I'm going. So take-home message is, I think joint loading is your friend, or at least it's not typically your foe. If you don't want to buy into it, it's necessarily your friend. So if you're pressed for time and have to sign off in the near future, you can sign off right now. You've already got the big story. But hopefully I'll convince you over the next half hour or so that this is a reasonable take-home message. If I'm going to describe what I study and why I study it, I kind of split it up into these two categories here. I'm interested in why humans move the way that we do, and I'm interested in how the way that we move affects our health. And today I'll focus more on this second question here. And under the second question, in how does the way that we move affect our health, you can kind of split that up into a gross level and into a fine level. And the gross level would be like, what types of movements do you do? Do you walk a lot? Do you run a lot? Do you cycle a lot? Do you do other movements? And then the fine level would be where, at least what I think of as biomechanics comes in. How do you walk? How do you run? Do you run like this? Do you run like that? And what's the effect of these different ways of running or different ways of doing any particular movement on the loading of the body and the long-term consequences of that loading on human health, on musculoskeletal health, and then on other indices of health. In a school of public health, which I'm in at Maryland, and which is kind of rare. There's not a whole lot of kinesiology departments, at least in the US, that are in a school of public health. The main public health issue that I focus on is knee osteoarthritis. And if you're not familiar with knee osteoarthritis, this is a picture of at least a common structural definition of knee osteoarthritis here. On the left, and these are both frontal plane radiographs of individuals standing with their body weight on their knees. On the left here would be a healthy knee with lots of good cartilage in between there. And on the right here is a knee where if you look on the medial side here, it has very little, if any, cartilage there. And so this would be basically bone on bone. This would be very late stage knee osteoarthritis. This would probably be pretty painful for this person, and they'd probably be a candidate for a total joint replacement. And their mobility is probably not all that good. This is probably somebody who would have trouble walking, let alone running or playing a lot of sports. So I got interested in this question on joint loading, and especially joint loading and running, and how it relates to knee osteoarthritis. I guess I wouldn't say I got interested to it this long ago, but I got exposed to it back when I was a grad student, and I was developing forward dynamics models of running. And this was back in like 2006, 2007 or so, and there's dozens of these things now, but back in those days, there weren't very many. There were 4 forward dynamics models of running. And they were all from here, all from the HPL. And one in particular got my attention. This one right here, this study by Gerald Cole, published in 1996. There's a line early on in the introduction of this study that really stuck with me. And this was a study about joint loading and running and the effect of muscles on joint loading and running. It's not really a study about osteoarthritis, but there's a line here early on in the introduction that I have highlighted here that really stuck with me. And I don't know about you all, but this sort of thing has happened to me a few times in my career, where I'll be reading a paper and they'll make some statement in it with references, and I'll be like, huh, that's interesting. That's surprising. I didn't know that. And then this was just, even though I wasn't studying osteoarthritis at the time, this just kind of stuck with me and was in the back of my head the whole time, and captured my interest some years down the road when I moved beyond kind of motor control aspects of running and got more interested in orthopedic aspects of running. And they say, however, runners as a group do not have a relatively high incidence of osteoarthritis than non-runners. And this is kind of surprising because we typically presume that osteoarthritis is mechanical in nature. It's from loading the cartilage too much and wearing the cartilage away. And then it seems like people who do run a lot and at fast speeds and long distances should have a high risk of osteoarthritis. But they generally don't. And so why is that? This seems like kind of a paradox if we accept that mechanical loading or excessive mechanical loading plays a role in osteoarthritis. So let's get some things out of the way first. I'm not saying no runners ever get osteoarthritis. I'm not saying everybody should run and prevent osteoarthritis. Yes, some runners get osteoarthritis. Yes, some of them even get it from their running. Yes, indeed, there's a genetic component to osteoarthritis. The shape of your knee can predispose you to knee osteoarthritis. Your parents having osteoarthritis can be a risk factor statistically for you getting osteoarthritis. But those things to me aren't very compelling explanations for why runners don't get a lot of osteoarthritis, or why running doesn't seem to increase the risk of osteoarthritis. Runners as a group don't tend to uniformly have more neutral knee alignment. They don't tend to uniformly have parents who were lacking in osteoarthritis. So these things to me are not very compelling or interesting possible explanations for why the mechanical loading from running doesn't seem to increase the risk of osteoarthritis. And so let's look at this through a different lens, through a biomechanics lens. Now, if we restrain our discussion to walking, at least to me, does appear to have a lot of strong evidence for joint loading playing a role in the progression of, and in some cases, even the initiation of the disease. These are all the studies that I can find in the literature longitudinally on the peak knee adduction moment in walking, which is kind of our big estimate of medial knee joint loading in biomechanics, peak knee adduction moment in walking, and the initiation and progression of osteoarthritis. Most of these studies are on progression, so starting at baseline with people that have a mild case of the disease and progressing to a worse case, but a handful of them are on initiation of the disease, starting with everyone healthy at baseline, and then over time seeing who develops osteoarthritis from an initial healthy state. And there are studies where you can see that some of them found no effect statistically or even a negative effect. But overall, a lot of studies found pretty strong positive effect sizes for greater knee adduction moment, greater knee joint loading being associated with the initiation and progression of the disease. And this is just for adduction moment. This effect gets stronger if you include impulse and flexion moment and other indices of medial knee joint loading, and a pretty strong moderate effect overall. Suggesting that walking with relatively high loads on your knees is a risk factor for the initiation and progression of the disease. This top one up here with the biggest effect, this Lin et al. Study, you can see it's just I didn't color it in, and it doesn't have any error bars. And why is that? That's because it was just one subject here who developed medial knee OA. If you haven't seen this study before, this is actually one of my favorite studies in biomechanics. This is their main kind of wow picture here. These were I think 28 60-something adults who they then measured their biomechanics at baseline and followed up with them about 7 years on average later. It's the only study that I know of that investigated the initiation of OA with a structural radiographic definition of osteoarthritis. And it's really interesting here. Only one participant out of these 28 developed osteoarthritis, or medial knee osteoarthritis, and they had this biggest medial knee adduction moment here. One other participant developed lateral osteoarthritis, and they had this smallest knee adduction moment down here. So just one subject that got medial and one subject that got lateral, but they were the two extremes here on the adduction moment, which I think is some really interesting data. Now, why does this happen? Why do these folks who place greater loads on their knee seem to have a greater risk for advancing structural progression of knee osteoarthritis or developing structural knee osteoarthritis? Well, if we take the perspective here of cumulative damage of cartilage, it makes a lot of sense. These are data from a recent study where they took explants of cartilage, so taking pieces of cartilage out of a joint, loading it in a material tester and basically hitting it with larger and larger loads repetitively until it breaks. And then from those data, if you do this test on lots of different explants of cartilage, you can construct a relationship here between the magnitude of the stresses that you place on the cartilage every loading cycle, and then on the x-axis, how many times the cartilage can sustain that stress until it breaks, or how many loading cycles of that stress it can sustain until it breaks. And so you can see here that as you increase the stress of the loading cycle, you decrease how many times you can sustain that stress before the cartilage is damaged, before it undergoes permanent change in shape or plastic deformation, if you will. And notice here that this is a log scale on the x-axis. So it's a highly nonlinear relationship. If you change the percent loading level here by 10%, that decreases how many cycles you can sustain by like a factor of 10, like an order of magnitude. So suggesting that this kind of makes sense from, at least from these data, why people that walk with high loads on their knee might be more at risk for osteoarthritis. But joint loads in running are dramatically higher than they are in walking. And so why don't runners then get osteoarthritis? Why do those really high loads in running seem to not be a problem, but the relatively high loads in walking compared to people that don't get OA, but that are still much smaller than loads in running, why do those seem to be a problem? Or why aren't these really high loads in running a problem a lot of the time? This is what really got me interested in this topic. If high loads in walking are a problem, why aren't high loads in running seemingly a problem for long-term knee joint health? From an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense that humans do not have a high risk of osteoarthritis. And I'll motivate this by showing a video of my favorite animal here, the cheetah. So that's real-time video there, and you saw the speed the cheetah was running at in Canadian units up there in the top. It's about 63 miles per hour in American units, if you're more used to that. I'm more used to the American units, but you guys probably understand the kilometers per hour a little bit better. Kevin DeLuzio, if you ever talk to him, has a great story about mixing up miles per hour and kilometers per hour. So someone pester him about that the next time you see Kevin. So I show this because a human can run nowhere near this fast. A human, I think Usain Bolt at like his top speed in the 200 meters might briefly get up to like 50K per hour. So roughly half as fast as a cheetah here. And there are animals, full-grown athletic humans and full-grown cheetahs who are roughly the same size. A cheetah's roughly 5 to 6 feet in stature, roughly 100 to 200 pounds or so. They're approximately the same size and mass as a human, yet they're tremendously athletic compared to a human. They're much faster, they're much better at accelerating and changing directions and complex maneuvers. Basically, if anything in the animal kingdom that is close to you in size wants to catch you and eat you, it's going to be able to. They're much, much faster and just more athletic than humans. But on the basis of endurance performance, not like sprint performance here, humans are about as good as it gets in the animal kingdom. There's some like specialized cursorial quadrupeds like gazelles in Africa that have to outrun the fastest lion every day or they die. They're better endurance runners than humans. The sled dogs that do the Iditarod up in Alaska and have VO2 maxes of like 250, they're better endurance runners than humans. But other than that, we're about as good as it gets at endurance running in the animal kingdom. And if you accept that we evolved to that state over some millions of years from a common ancestor that was probably more like a modern chimpanzee who aren't good endurance runners, then it makes sense that if we developed that good running ability over a long time, it probably also wasn't causing this crippling orthopedic condition that makes it impossible to run over that same time. So evolutionarily, this makes a lot of sense that running doesn't seem to cause OA a lot of the time. So that's an evolutionary perspective. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, I'm a biomechanist, and so I like to take more of a biomechanics lens on this. So can we answer this question, this central question, through a biomechanics lens of why do some people get osteoarthritis and others don't, which I'll return to at the end here. But in the meantime, we'll talk mostly about runners specifically. Why don't runners get osteoarthritis? I like this topic because, or this role of joint loading in osteoarthritis and in runners, because it gives a lot of opportunities for collaboration, investigating the mechanosensitivity of structures in the body, which is an opportunity to collaborate with colleagues with expertise in that. There's socioeconomic factors and race-related factors that affect osteoarthritis that I'll touch on again at the end here in some future work. And then I'll also touch here on how my perspective on this has changed since I started studying it around 2010, 2012 or so. Now, for this notion of mechanosensitivity, which I think is clear, is really key here in this question of why doesn't joint loading and running seem to cause osteoarthritis very, very often. I think this notion of mechanosensitivity is key here. What is mechanosensitivity? These are cells in the body whose metabolism is triggered by mechanical loading, or whose metabolism is sensitive to the mechanical loading and the stress and strain on that cell. And for some reason, we treat every tissue in the body, historically, we treat every tissue in the body as if it's like this, except for cartilage. And I've tried to figure out like where in the literature this perspective on cartilage being this kind of dead, inert tissue comes from, and I can't really find it. I don't really know where that comes from. Even in like the earliest studies on osteoarthritis, like if you look back and look at some of the like 1950s Kellgren and Lawrence studies, even in there, they're recognizing that excess weight, excess loading in obese adults is not a satisfactory explanation for the prevalence of osteoarthritis in obese adults. Something more complicated is going on. So I don't actually know where this perspective that cartilage is this like dead, inert structure that just gets worn down by too much loading over time comes from. But for whatever reason, that's kind of historically how we think of cartilage. And we don't treat most other tissues in the body like that. Like for bone or for muscle, for example, it's pretty widely accepted in science and also I would say in the general population that that tissue can respond positively to damage and mechanical loading, right? Like if I go and lift a weight and do a little micro damage to my muscle, then my body, given proper rest and nutrition, repairs that and repairs it back intelligently. It says, okay, you damaged me. The next time you put this load on me, I don't want it to damage me as much. So I'm going to build it back smart. I'm going to build it back stronger than it was before. Muscle does that. Most soft tissues in the body do that. Bone does that. I think cartilage also does that to some extent, but for some reason, we don't have that perspective on cartilage a lot of the time. An example that I'll use to motivate this is studies on the metabolic cost of walking in people with limb loss. And I promise this will have some relevance to osteoarthritis eventually. Generally speaking, if you lose part of one of your legs, your metabolic cost of walking with a prosthesis is pretty high. And that's what this graph is showing without going too much into it. However, if you look at very healthy, very fit individuals who have on the scope of severity of limb loss, have pretty mild limb loss, like a below knee limb loss with a fairly long residual limb, they generally don't have a very high metabolic cost of walking. If you look at like very fit, very healthy, relatively young military service members with transtibial limb loss, they actually statistically have the same metabolic cost as healthy, young, fit military service members. Why is that? Well, I think it's related to the strength of their muscles. And we recently did a simulation study on this, where the kind of the take-home message was, if you lose part of your one of your legs below the knee, you can actually retain a normal metabolic cost as long as the rest of the remaining muscles in your body retain their normal strength. If you lose even a little bit of that strength, if you lose even 10% of the strength of the muscles, and especially the strength of the muscles in that residual limb, then your metabolic cost goes up. So the so-called high metabolic cost of walking with the transtibial prosthesis and transtibial limb loss may not necessarily be due to the prosthesis or to limb loss per se. It may be due to the plasticity of the muscles and the loss of strength of the muscles. And so we can train those muscles up. They're mechanically sensitive. We can damage them and they can trigger a metabolic response that builds them back stronger. So an example of mechanosensitivity being beneficial for performance in pathological movement. But for some reason, we don't treat cartilage like that. At least that's not a common, at least layperson, and in many realms of science, a common perspective on cartilage. We treat cartilage more like this thing. And I only lived in Canada for a couple of years. I can't remember if these things are in Canada or not, but I think they are. Do you guys use these? Does anyone know what this is? What is it? Anybody?
It's a scrubbing sponge.
Right, it's a sponge you wash your dishes with, right? And have you had just one of these your whole life, or have you used a couple of these, several of these? Several, right? You haven't had just one for the last 30, 40 years, 50 years. That's because you use it too much and it gets worn out. It loses its elasticity. It's not as frictiony. Stuff gets stuck in it and it starts to stink and just doesn't work as well anymore. Okay? That's because this thing has no ability to adapt, no ability to repair itself back to its original state. And this is kind of how we treat cartilage. And I'm not really sure why we treat cartilage like that. Cartilage indeed has no connection to the nervous system, and this is why we can load our joints and it doesn't hurt when there's cartilage in there. I think this perspective is largely because it has no connection to the circulatory system, but it at least normally has no connection, no direct connection. There's no veins going into cartilage, but it does have this bath of synovial fluid that surrounds it, which is secreted by a synovial membrane, and which does have a vascular supply, which does have a blood supply. So cartilage actually does have a source of blood and of nutrition. It's just kind of indirect through that synovial membrane, which does have a blood supply. So I think this is not a great perspective to take on how cartilage is structured and how it functions. It does indeed have a living biological adaptability to it to some extent. In 2012, my perspective on why running doesn't cause osteoarthritis very often, I thought we had this figured out. We did a study and had people come into the lab and did traditional gait analysis, and they walked and ran over force plates and mocap and all the usual things. Estimated the load on their knee and found on the left here that, yeah, the peak load every step you take in running is quite a bit higher than when you walk. It's on the ballpark of 2 to 3 times higher on average. But if you cast that load on the joint not as the peak load on the left, but as what we call the per unit distance load, or the cumulative load on the right, the load per unit distance traveled, those are actually statistically the same in walking and running, or they're statistically at least not different between walking and running. You can think of this as the load that you would accumulate on your joint to go a certain distance. Like if you're going to go a mile and you can walk that mile or run that mile, how much loading do you build up on your knee in that time? Well, it's about the same. Doesn't matter if you walk or run. It's the distance traveled that's going to dictate how much you accumulate there. And so this, I thought I had this figured out here. I thought, oh, it's because the peak load doesn't really matter all that much, and it's all about the total distance that you travel. And if you walk and if you run, it doesn't matter. It's, you know, running doesn't really accumulate that much load per unit distance traveled. That doesn't make a lot of sense here, though, if we go back to this stress life plot here, where these are peak loads here on this y-axis. Okay, these are the peak stress on that chunk of cartilage with every loading cycle. And this shows, I think, pretty definitively in real cartilage, not in a model of cartilage, that the higher the peak load, the fewer cycles you can sustain of that peak load. And there's been several studies on this, and some of them on animal cartilage, some of them on human cartilage. And every single one of them that I know of has concluded that this is a possible plausible mechanism for osteoarthritis. If you cast this as the stresses that cartilage experiences in daily living over a lifespan, it's very possible to exhaust that stress life within a human lifespan. And so when I started getting into this literature, then I kind of started to rethink this. I said, maybe I've been too dismissive here of these peak loads. Maybe there's something else going on here, and maybe I've got kind of a red herring here with this per unit distance load business. So in 2020 here, 8 years later, my perspective has kind of changed. I no longer really think that osteoarthritis is caused by too high cumulative load or even necessarily by too high peak loads. I think it's more about unusual loads. And by unusual loads, I mean that I think cartilage can be conditioned to withstanding certain types of loads. And so what is it that makes a joint load high, or what is it that makes it unusual? Well, it's high if it's a load that it's not used to sustaining, that it hasn't been conditioned to sustain, that it hasn't adapted to sustaining. I've been running, for example, for about 25 years, ever since I was about 13, 14 years old. And so I've been placing these peak loads of 6 to 10, 12 times my body weight on my joints for a long time. I hope to continue to keep doing that for a long time. But my cartilage is conditioned to withstanding those loads. So for me, those loads are not high. For somebody that's my age but has only walked or has only cycled or has never done an activity that places those kind of loads that are similar to running on the joint, then for them, those loads would be high. They'd be relatively high compared to what their joints are accustomed to and what they're conditioned to. So kind of just a recasting, a reframing of what it is that makes a joint load high or what it is that makes it unusual. Well, it's a load that joint is not used or accustomed to sustaining. So we first investigated this idea in individuals with limb loss. I have the good fortune of having a lot of collaborators at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. They have access to a lot of military populations and can get a lot of nice data and do a lot of nice studies on these service members with limb loss. And so we did a study here on the loading of the medial knee in control subjects in relatively young U.S. military service members that were in good health, and that's the control labeled white line here. And then also compared that to the medial knee joint load in 10 service members with limb loss. The yellow line was the average of 5 folks with transtibial below knee limb loss, and the blue line was 5 others with transfemoral or above knee limb loss. Generally, you wouldn't lump those populations together. They're quite different, but because their joint loads here were pretty similar, we combined them here statistically in these studies. And so here we did indeed see a little bit higher peak load on the medial knee in the individuals with limb loss compared to the control participants. And so maybe this is the reason why these folks have a high risk of osteoarthritis later on in life. Limb loss is a pretty big risk factor statistically for osteoarthritis. Like if you lose part of your right leg, your odds of getting osteoarthritis in your left leg go pretty high later on in life. And so maybe this is why these folks had a high risk, or may have a high risk for osteoarthritis later on in life. But is this a big difference? Is this a meaningful difference? Is an average here of 1.5 body weights versus, I don't know, 1.7, 1.8 body weights, is that really a lot? Is that a meaningful difference? Especially considering that people with limb loss are typically less physically active than people without limb loss and less mobile. So they're probably not placing this load on their joint all that many times compared to a person with 2 healthy intact legs. Is this really large enough to be meaningful? I'm not sure. So I was a little skeptical of this result, even though this was statistically significant and all that business. So this got me thinking, well, what else? And especially under this paradigm of unusual loads and unusually high loads that the joint isn't used to, what else do people with limb loss do that people without limb loss may not do, that may place kind of weird loads on the joint? And here's a movement that they do. And a lot of them don't necessarily do high jumps after they've lost a leg, but these are just some impressive feats of athleticism here by folks with limb loss. I have a hard enough time getting over a high jump bar of any height with 2 good legs, and they can do it with just 1 good leg. But notice what they're doing here. They are hopping on 1 leg, right? And this is actually a pretty common movement that people with limb loss do. You usually see them walking around in their prosthesis, right? And that's mostly what we study in biomechanics, walking with the prosthesis. But they actually do a lot of one-legged hopping. They actually typically hop dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times on 1 leg every day. And why might they do that? Well, picture that if you have a prosthetic leg, donning and removing and taking on and taking off the prosthetic leg is not a quick, straightforward, easy process. It can take even somebody who's used to it and very experienced with it. It can take you 5, maybe 10 minutes to take the leg on and off. So picture you're at home, you're on the couch, you're relaxing, you don't have your leg on, and it's a commercial, and you want to get up and go to the kitchen and get a snack. Are you going to take your leg off and hop, or put your leg on and walk? You might probably just hop, right? If it's going to take you 5 to 10 minutes to put the leg on, you're going to hop or walk to the kitchen and get your snack and come back, and you've missed part of the show. The commercial break's only like 3 minutes, right? So it's a lot quicker to just hop and get the snack and then hop back. Or picture you're in bed at night. They typically don't wear the prosthesis when they're sleeping because it's not all that comfortable. You're in bed at night and you wake up and you got to go to the bathroom. Again, are you going to take 5 to 10 minutes to put your leg on? No, you're probably just going to hop to the bathroom. So this got us interested in this comparison between the unusual loads of hopping, which most people don't do as adults, compared to the more usual, more typical loads of walking. And so we investigated this in a gait analysis with folks who were military service members at Walter Reed, who had a limb loss here. These were individuals with either transfemoral or transtibial limb loss, and compared the mechanical load on the knee in hopping versus walking across the force plates. Pretty typical generic gait analysis here. On the left here, or on the top, is walking, and on the bottom here is hopping. The 2 panels on the left are the knee adduction moment, and the 2 panels on the right are the flexion moment. And you can see the adduction moment is a little bit higher, but not actually all that much higher in hopping versus walking. But the flexion moment is where we saw the really big difference, which kind of makes sense if you know much about one-legged hopping versus 2-legged walking. The flexion moment is just dramatically bigger in one-legged hopping versus 2-legged walking in these folks that have transtibial and transfemoral limb loss and actually hop on 1 leg to get around the house and to get around the world, more generally speaking. So we did an analysis of these moments using a stress life model, using a cumulative damage and a probabilistic model of failure of the cartilage in the joints. If you take those moments, and if you assume that the difference in moments scales proportionally with the difference in stress placed on the knee cartilage, you can fit a curve to these stress life data up here. And from that, estimate how many loading cycles of hopping is equivalent, or how many loading cycles of walking is equivalent to the damage of a loading cycle of hopping or of walking. So kind of casting the damage and the probability of long-term failure of the joint in hopping relative to walking. Okay? And so that's what we did here. I'm leaving out a lot of methods there on how you actually do those models and develop those models. You can read Joseph's paper down here, read any of Brent's recent papers if you're interested in the specifics of the methods on it. On the left here is if you cast the damage per meter of hopping relative to walking that same meter. You accumulate in the ballpark of at least 10 times as much damage per unit distance there when you hop versus when you walk. And on the right here, and this other one is casting it in terms of strides. And so every hop that you take is, at least in the range of the data here, is worth the damage of about 8 strides of walking. Okay, so about 10 meters of walking equivalent to the damage of 1 meter of hopping, and about eight strides of walking equivalent to the damage of 1 stride of hopping. If you want to cast that as a probability of osteoarthritis, what we found here was that if you hop just 100 times a day, which is not all that much for somebody that's hopping frequently, you about double your risk of osteoarthritis compared to over 30 years compared to just walking all the time. And if you hop up to about 200 times per day, then you're at 50%. Then it's a coin flip chance over your adult lifespan of developing osteoarthritis here from this model. So some support, I think, for this idea that maybe it's not coming from too much loading and walking. Maybe it's coming from really unusual loads in movements that the joint is not conditioned to and is not accustomed to. So back to running here. Why then still don't runners get knee osteoarthritis? The hopping data suggests that they should, right? Loading and hopping and loading and running are not exactly the same, but they're kind of conceptually similar, right? When I run, I'm placing all of my weight on one leg and doing this kind of hopping motion. I'm just alternating between my legs. I'm not just doing it on one leg. A key element of those hopping studies is that these were adult subjects who lost their leg at about the age of 20 or 30, typically in military combat and blast wound injuries, traumatic injuries to the leg requiring amputation, things like that. They then start hopping frequently for the very first time when they are full-grown adults in their 20s and in their 30s. By that point, the macromolecule of cartilage, the collagen, which gives its elasticity and its overall springy type structure and function, has essentially lost all of its adaptability. It's essentially lost all of its ability to feasibly adapt positively to mechanical loading. How do I know that, or why do I say that? This delves into some tissue biology that's a little bit over my head, but is still really interesting. This was a really cool study in Science Medicine by Heinemeyer a few years ago. My colleagues in tissue biology said that this was going to be like a game changer in like drug-based therapies for osteoarthritis. I'm not sure if it has been. That's not really my world, but maybe it has been. This was also the first study that actually taught me how carbon dating works, right? That's one of these things in science you hear about, and that, no, we use carbon dating to figure out how old stuff is. Well, how does that actually work? This is a graph of the birth year of samples of cartilage from live humans versus the carbon-14 content in those samples of cartilage. Okay, that's what's shown in the symbols here on the graph. Some of them had osteoarthritis, some of them didn't, some of them had a history of high loading on the joint, some of them didn't, and there wasn't really any differences between there, so they lumped them all together. This other line here, this solid white line, is the level of carbon-14 in the atmosphere on planet Earth during these years. And you can see it's kind of low from 1940 up till the mid-50s, then suddenly starts dramatically spiking up and really peaks in like the mid-60s, and then gradually starts dropping down over time to present time. Anyone know what this was from, this kind of spike in carbon-14 in the atmosphere from like 1950 to 1970 or so? Any guesses?
Nuclear testing.
Nuclear testing, exactly. This was the height of the Cold War here, the US and the Soviet Union in the race here to build bigger and bigger and more powerful nuclear weapons and stockpiling nuclear weapons. And so that's where this spike in carbon content came from. That carbon in the atmosphere gets into the tissues of your body. And so you can look at the concentration of that carbon in a tissue like cartilage, and from that, in comparing it to the content of the carbon that was should have been in the tissue in its birth year to figure out how old it is. Okay? So they sampled all of these different ages of cartilage in 2012, 2013 or so. And so if all of them were very new cartilage cells, like if the cartilage was constantly turning over and refreshing itself, the collagen was constantly turning over and refreshing itself, then you would expect to see, regardless of the birth year, you'd expect to see this dashed line here. Everybody has the carbon content of the current atmosphere of the sampling time. If it's really, really old cartilage, like you're born with it, and then you're just stuck with that your whole life, then we would expect to see the data here, the dots, kind of follow along this atmospheric carbon content here. Okay? If we see something like this, where the data kind of follow that shape, but are like lagged behind it, that lag is the age at which the cartilage stopped turning over, at which it stopped being replaced by new collagen. I keep saying cartilage here, I mean collagen specifically. This was on collagen specifically. That lag there, that gap between the data and the atmospheric line, is essentially the age of the person at which the collagen stopped refreshing itself, stopped turning over, and stopped laying down new cartilage and getting rid of new collagen and getting rid of the old collagen. And so that gap there is in the ballpark of like 10 to 20 years, which is typically in most adults the age of like skeletal maturity. Beyond the age of 20, maybe 25 or so, you've pretty much reached your full physical size. You're not going to get much taller and much bigger. So suggesting beyond the age of maybe 15, 20, 25, if you're lucky, whatever cartilage or whatever collagen you have in your cartilage at that time, that's pretty much what you're stuck with for the rest of your life. And so that window in early adulthood is your window to load the collagen and have the collagen hopefully adapt positively and grow stronger in response to that load. So we were interested here with this idea that you can condition your cartilage to hypothetically be stronger, but possibly only fairly early in life. We were interested in if this is a feasible, compelling explanation for why runners don't get osteoarthritis. Maybe it's because most of them start running fairly early in life when that collagen is still adaptable and can still respond positively to the damage from that mechanical loading and adapt to it and grow stronger because of it. So we basically repeated the 2012 study. We had 22 subjects, I believe, come into the lab and walk and run at self-selected speeds. We again computed the load on the medial knee with inverse dynamics and static optimization and typical methods there. Got the purple or the blue line here for medial load on the knee in running, and the yellow line here for medial load on the knee in walking. We then plugged those loads into this discrete element model of the knee over here. And this is a fairly complicated model that I've tried to illustrate fairly simply here. It's actually a three-dimensional model, but it's easier to demonstrate if you just look at it two-dimensionally here. The cartilage is modeled as this bed of springs connecting the tibia to the femur up here. And the curvature of the femur varies here with the knee flexion angle. So it captures the observation that in deeper angles of knee flexion and running, the contact area there between those bones and between those cartilage surfaces tend to change. There's also a meniscus here that acts as kind of a measure of congruency and spreading the load out a little bit more. That's not obvious from the image here. So a discrete element model of the human knee, essentially. We plug in these loads to it, and they end up resulting in a distribution of stresses and strains on these elements of cartilage. We then take those stresses and strains on those cartilage elements and plug them into this stress life model of articular cartilage. With that, we can then assume certain things about what relates to cartilage health in the long term, and can investigate hypothetically your risk of developing osteoarthritis with and without certain biological elements in the cartilage, and for different assumed hypothetical physical activity levels. And so again, I'm leaving out a lot of the mathematical details here. My advisor, Graham Caldwell, told me once that every time you show an equation in your talk, you lose half of your audience. So if I show one equation here, I lose half of you. If I show two, I've lost 3/4 of everybody. So we're going to try and get through this, not showing any equations today. This stress life model of cartilage, you plug in your typical joint load data from our typical models. Out of this, you get distributions of stresses and strains on the tissue in question, which in this case is the cartilage. You then take those strains we used to, you can do it with stresses too, we did it with strains. And from that, you plug it into this statistical model of the stress life of cartilage. And what is that exactly? The three key elements to it are the damage on the cartilage, the repair of the cartilage, and the adaptation of the cartilage. You can think of damage as the fraction of the mechanical life of the cartilage consumed with each loading cycle. And as repair, you can think of repair as the ability of the cartilage to naturally heal itself. This repair element I kind of struggled with. I only ever found one study in the literature that had any data on like the natural repair of cartilage from damage. They followed up with folks who were getting knee surgery after a 5-year gap and saw some repair of lesions and fissures in the cartilage over 5 years. And so to avoid favoring our hypothesis here that you need adaptation of the cartilage to be able to run healthy for decades, I made a pretty generous assumption here on the capacity of cartilage to repair. We assumed that over 5 years, you can repair most of the damage done naturally. And over a very long amount of time, over many decades, you can repair essentially all of the damage done to cartilage. The other piece that's in the model here is then adaptation, which is changes to the healthy structure and function of cartilage that happens in response to this damage. So repairing it, but repairing it back on top of how it initially was and making it stronger than it initially was. So to get the damage model here, you essentially fit a curve to this stress life data here from cartilage material tests. We can convert this to a probabilistic model by fitting another curve to the scatter around these data, and I won't get into the details there. But this attaches an element of probability to the cartilage failure model. This gives me the ability to cast the percent odds of getting osteoarthritis, either on an individual level or on a population group level, given uncertainty in subject-specific parameters here. Given that, for example, if you do my study, I don't know the material properties of your cartilage specifically. I don't know the stress life of your cartilage specifically, but I can assume it's probably reasonably within the range of the scatter of these data here that I do know the stress life on. We can then examine the probability of osteoarthritis over a given number of years, say an adult lifespan of 50 years or so, say from age 30 to age 80 or in that ballpark, assuming different hypothetical activity levels, like if you only walk or if you run and walk. I was interested here in what's the stresses on the joint that we get here for running, because I really couldn't find any data on that in the literature. So these, I think, might be maybe not the only, but some of the only data in the literature on model-based estimates of stresses on the medial knee cartilage in running. We saw in walking it averaged in the ballpark of about 3 megapascals peak, and in running it averaged about 6 megapascals peak. So again, suggesting if we go back to our damage model here, that running should easily cause osteoarthritis, right? If I double my loading level here, even from 10% to 20%, then I'm having my cartilage fail in less than 1 million loading cycles, which is well within the loading cycles of an adult human lifespan. So why doesn't this happen? To figure that out, we ran the model with and without repair included in it, and with and without adaptation included in it. On the left is the model-based probability of failure of the medial knee cartilage, so a structural definition of osteoarthritis, essentially. If over the ages of 23 to 83, you walk 6 kilometers a day, you don't run at all, and you don't have any adaptation to your cartilage from mechanical loading earlier in life. If you assume no repair, which is in the yellow, then by age 80 or so, you have about a 40% risk of developing osteoarthritis. If you assume repair, you have about maybe a 13% risk of developing osteoarthritis. And these match up pretty well with global prevalences of osteoarthritis in various studies. They range anywhere from like 7% up to like 40%, depending on a variety of factors. So it matches up pretty well with population level data on prevalence and incidence of osteoarthritis. If we do the same run of the model there, but throw in a little bit of running, you take 3 of those walking kilometers and replace them with 3 kilometers of running, then everybody gets OA. The odds of getting osteoarthritis with repair were 99% by the end of your life, and the odds of getting it even, without repair were essentially 100%. And even if you include repair, it was still 95, 96% on average risk of getting osteoarthritis. So suggesting running is bad for our joints from the middle plot here. We know this middle plot, this does not happen in reality. Runners do not have a 95, 99% chance of getting osteoarthritis over the lifespan. Why not? The only way, at least within the limits of this model, to get a failure probability on the right here of running 3 miles a day and running 3 kilometers per day and walking 3 kilometers per day. The only way to get that to match the failure probabilities of just walking those 6 kilometers per day was to include adaptation in the model, to allow the stiffness of the cartilage, the modulus, the thickness of the cartilage, and the congruency of the joint contact, which is adaptations to the shape of the bone, basically, allowing those to increase by roughly 1 standard deviation in these first 23 years of life in response to mechanical loading like running experienced during those years of life. Only then was this model able to produce estimates of probability of osteoarthritis over the lifespan that were reasonably realistic, that were similar to what you see in the epidemiological literature, where running versus walking doesn't seem to carry a disparate risk of osteoarthritis over a lifespan. And then this is just those same data, but pulled out from age 55, which is a common age of first diagnosis of osteoarthritis, just trying to make it a little bit more clear here, where if all I do is walk and I have repair, about 13% odds over the lifespan, or up to middle age there of age 55 of osteoarthritis. If I throw in 3 kilometers per day of running and no adaptation, everyone gets OA except for this guy. If I then allow the cartilage to adapt, then I get the failure probability being back down to what it was when I was walking, only even if I include the 3 kilometers per day of running. So in conclusion, at least based on these data, it seems like cartilage is unlikely to withstand a lifetime of mechanical loading from running, even fairly moderate amounts of running. The subjects that were in this study averaged about a 10-minute mile pace for this self-selected speed, so not a terribly aggressive pace there. And we assumed here running a pretty modest amount of running, about 13 miles per week. These conclusions are not dramatically sensitive to increasing the mileage of running or the volume of running, the volume of walking. They're very sensitive to increasing the speed, for example, and increasing the intensity of the mechanical link, but not so severe, not so sensitive to the amount of running necessarily. We saw this even though the cumulative load, the load per unit distance traveled on the medial knee, was again statistically the same between walking and running. So arguing against my earlier 2012, 2014 conclusion that running doesn't cause OA much because of cumulative load. It seems like that's probably not a plausible explanation, or at least a meaningful explanation for why running doesn't often cause osteoarthritis. Only way in the model that we were able to get realistic probabilities of osteoarthritis was by following this cartilage conditioning hypothesis, that adaptation of the cartilage early on in life, strengthening of the cartilage early on in life was necessary to see that. If we accept that as reality, I think that has some important public health messages. If we go back to the Heinemeyer carbon dating study that says you get to age 20 and that's it, that's all you've got in terms of collagen and stiffness of the collagen matrix. I think that has major public health implications for promoting physical activity in children and in growth and in development, that you can adapt your cartilage. It can get stronger just like a muscle and just like bone, but your capacity as you age beyond young adulthood is going to be limited for that. So load the joint when you're young to condition it, because that's probably what you're going to be stuck with for most of the rest of your life. So that's what I've been working on recently. I'll wrap up here with a little bit on where we're going in the future. I don't think we're ever going to solve this running and OA question, probably. The highest level of evidence for something like this would be clinical trials, right? And we're just never going to see a clinical trial on this that I think is going to convince people. We can't randomize people to a lifetime of running. We can't randomize people to being physically active in their childhood versus not physically active in their childhood and then following them until they're 90 years old. That's just not going to happen. And so I think to continue to study this, we're going to have to continue to rely on observational studies, on short-term interventions, and on modeling studies. Beyond this, I'm also interested in kind of in a similar direction of how there's lots of these seemingly different disparate populations that get osteoarthritis. So lots of demographical risk factors that don't seem to have a lot in common. Age and obesity are the two ones you hear a lot about. Those are the big risk factors for osteoarthritis, but also sex. Women in general have a higher risk. Race, African Americans, I don't know about African Canadians, but African Americans tend to have a higher risk than Caucasians. Asian Americans tend to have a little bit lower risk than Caucasians, and much lower than African Americans. Injury is a factor, whether it's direct injury to the joint itself, ACL tear, meniscus tear, or indirect injury, like I said, the traumatic limb loss and increasing the risk of osteoarthritis in the other leg. These populations, what does an older obese woman have in common with a 30-year-old military amputee with a torn ACL in that leg as well? What do they have in common? Not much on the surface. So maybe it's their joint loading. Maybe they somehow move in a way that places distributions of loads on the joints that are the same. This would be a very difficult study to do on all of these populations, but I think we can chip away at it by making some comparisons here. And I think it's one of those questions that has an interesting, important take-home message, regardless of how it turns out, regardless of whether joint loading ties them together or not. That would be an interesting and important conclusion, I think. In terms of specific studies, we're doing along these lines already. I'm doing one or trying to get one off the ground with some pilot data on aging and OA. The other big public health issue with older adults that along with osteoarthritis that you see a lot is also dementia, cognitive impairment. And dementia typically comes after osteoarthritis. Typically, you get osteoarthritis in your 50s and 60s, and you're not typically diagnosed with dementia until 70s or 80s or so, so a couple decades later on. Serum COMP, serum cartilage oligomeric matrix protein, is a well-known biomarker for the incidence of osteoarthritis. It tends to be higher in folks who go on to develop osteoarthritis. The concentration of it in your blood serum is related to the response of the cartilage to mechanical loading, to walking exercise. You see an elevated concentration of it after walking. And in particular, and this is a really great study here, if you haven't seen it before, by Jenny Earhart here in 2012 in Tom Andriaki's lab, people that went on to experience more cartilage loss over 5 years at baseline had a greater increase in the concentration of serum comp after walking exercise compared to those who did not develop large amounts of cartilage loss over those 5 years. So serum comp here I think is a pretty important biomarker for osteoarthritis and could relate to its material properties and to its response to mechanical loading. What's this have to do with dementia and Alzheimer's? Serum comp, I just recently learned this from a neuroscience and exercise psych colleague, is also involved in the activation of the complement cascade, which I don't know much about, but is related to most theories on the neuroinflammation mechanisms of Alzheimer's, and how Alzheimer's is a disease of inflammation, kind of how cartilage is often considered partially a disease of inflammation, a problem of biology and a problem of mechanics. So perhaps these diseases are related to each other. Perhaps one precedes the other, and perhaps mechanical loading can be a key to that mechanism. The other one I'm interested on here, and this is one I'm really excited about because we actually have data on it, is race and OA. Like I said, African Americans have a high prevalence of knee osteoarthritis, but it's really specific. It's really particular. It's particularly high among women, African American women versus Caucasian women, and it's typically seen in the lateral knee in particular, which is not a common place to get osteoarthritis. It's mostly in the medial knee. Is there a biomechanical reason for this? Is there a biomechanical explanation for this? I don't know, but at least in our pilot data here on the right, there seems to be. These are really small sample sizes. There's like 12 subjects in total here, so I'm not super confident in these, but these are all young adult women. These are all young college age women. African Americans on the right, Caucasians on the left, and higher peak lateral knee joint loads when they walked at a common speed here for the African Americans. And it's another one of those things that I think can have an interesting and important outcome no matter how it turns out here. Maybe this is a false positive. I think it might be, but is mechanical loading a sufficient explanation for this race-related difference? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I think it's important to clarify that. So I'm hoping to do that in the near future. In terms of some practical take-home messages from this, and I'm being a little bit speculative here, but I think that's okay. Speculation's fun. If somebody wants to take up running, is that safe for them? Will it wear out their joints? Is it bad for their joints? I think the key question there is, were you physically active as a child? If we buy into this cartilage conditioning hypothesis. If somebody played sports as a child and then, in college got away from it, were too busy, didn't exercise much, and then in middle age wants to take up running, I think they'd have a much better chance of doing that successfully than somebody who is a lifetime sedentary, who may have a little bit more trouble. In terms of people that are already running, runners often take a down week. This is my annual training log in terms of hours on the right here, split up by my different activities. I like it because you can tell, if you look closely, you can tell when I was too injured to run much. You can tell when COVID started and the pool closed, and you can tell when classes ended and I started working out more. So you can glean a lot of information about my life just from looking at this graph here. But runners often take a down week where we don't run so much and ramp down our volume. If you're going to take a down week, at least based on this cumulative damage idea, I think you should skip the workout. And I know a lot of runners who, when they take a down week, they ramp down the volume, but they still do the intense stuff because they don't want to lose the edge there. They still do the track workout, still do the speed, still keep that intensity high and keep the volume low. From a cumulative damage perspective, maybe that's not a great idea. It's the peak loads, it's the peak damage that's driving things here. And maybe skipping the workout then, if you're worried about wearing things out, is the better way to go. And maybe the volume isn't all that important. And my last point here is one that I think is a key here to examining osteoarthritis in runners and to orthopedic issues in runners. And I stole this from Dr. Herzog a little bit. I know this is something I've heard him say before, but injuries in runners are really high, right? Not to say that running is good for your knees. The knee is by far the most commonly injured site in runners, at least in most studies. It doesn't get osteoarthritis much, but it does get lots of other knee injuries. And some people, though, don't get injured. And maybe we need to be looking more at those people. Maybe injured is kind of the natural state of running, and maybe it's the ones who don't get injured who are the unusual ones and who are doing something different and something special. Maybe those people are the key to figuring out what's causing injuries by examining these kind of bulletproof runners who don't get injured much. I used to think I was one of these people until I actually started running a lot. When I actually started running, 40, 50, 60 miles a week, and I'm like, okay, I get injured just like everybody else. But some people are able to sustain that amount of running for years and years and years and years for a lifespan and never get hurt. Why? What's special about them? What are they doing? Is it their mechanics? Is it their tissues? What's happening there that allows them to do that? I think is a really interesting question. And lastly, I'll just say that it's okay to change your ideas. Hopefully you saw here how I've basically completely changed my perspective on this. In 2012, 2014, I thought it was all cumulative load. In 2020, I've pretty much abandoned that. I don't think it's cumulative load. I think it's more about the peak loads here being high and that being good, at least as an early, as a young adult, and inducing my cartilage to have a metabolic response that strengthens that cartilage, that makes these cumulative loads that I build up when I'm running not a big deal, and makes my joint able to sustain those loads despite these peak loads being very high. Okay, I will wrap it up here by thanking my funding and my collaborators in my lab and collaborators at primarily at Walter Reed and the students who contributed to this. And I would love to take some questions or just have a conversation about this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross. I really enjoyed your talk. Before we have a discussion period started, Walter, did you want to make a quick announcement?
I'm going to make a quick announcement. We have talked a little bit about this in the group, and many of you stay behind the camera, and for the discussion, I know for the presentation that's sometimes a little bit irritating for the speaker when people move around and so on the screen, but here for the discussion section that's coming now, I would really appreciate if everybody who feels comfortable would turn their screens on. And I heard there is a university ruling that we actually cannot force you. We cannot force you to turn on the screens, but I think it would make for a nicer environment also for Ross, who is a guest here in the laboratory and in the seminar. So I would like, if you feel comfortable, to turn on the screen so that he sees who we are and all that, and that might also make for a little bit of a livelier discussion. So thank you for doing that. Good. And now, Song-Won, it's all yours.
Thank you, Walter. So since I now see more than 50 people at the same time, so if you have any question to our speaker, please use the raise hand button. So if you click the icon labeled participants at the bottom center of your screen, then you can find the raise hand button, which is blue color, at the bottom on the right side. Now I will open the seminar to the question. Yes, Dr. Shim, please go ahead.
Okay, Ross, good to see you in Canada.
Yeah.
We meet just once a week for the lab meeting, but it was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. So your talk was focusing mostly on the stress on the cartilage, but what about the strength, particularly straight range dependent resistance of the cartilage? In other words, how does the viscoelastic property plays a role in the probability of away in terms of walking and running? And the second question is about the variability. What about the stride-to-stride variability in locomotion? For example, loading the same spot over and over again versus say, loading different spots over repetitions with greater variability in the locomotion, particularly in running.
Sure. The strain and the strain rate question is a very, very important question. I glossed over it a little bit, but the model here is actually based on input strain, not on input stress. I do that because I think strain is, the closest analog to damage. Damage I consider, plastic deformation, permanent change in the structure of it, and so the model is actually driven by input strains of the cartilage. The observed mechanical properties of cartilage are indeed, in a general sense, very sensitive to loading rate and to strain rate. But within the confines of human locomotion, I don't think they're as sensitive as we often give them credit for. If you look at, say, the modulus of cartilage, when you load it at different loading rates, it is extremely sensitive to it up to about the loading rate of maybe half the typical loading rate of walking. And then beyond that, it really doesn't change a whole lot. And so the kind of I'll call it the elastic region of cartilage in terms of the relationship between stiffness and loading rate kind of plateauing is typically reached well within the range of strain rates you experience during different speeds of walking and different speeds of running. So it's not the best assumption in the world, but I think it's a reasonable assumption to say that the modulus and the observed kind of bulk material properties of cartilage are essentially the same in walking and running, unless you were comparing two really extreme cases. In the model here, we actually did build in a little bit of strain rate sensitivity to the material properties. It actually had slightly different material properties in walking and running, just to make sure we weren't underestimating that issue. But in general, I don't think it's a major driving factor, at least in comparing walking and running. It certainly is a huge factor if you're comparing like running to standing, like categorically different types of loading, static loading versus dynamic loading. But for different speeds of like physiological dynamic loading, I don't think it's a major factor most of the time. Variability, I have no idea. That's the old Joe Hamill theory on injuries and motor control. Some variability is good, some variability is bad. If you have a lot of variability, then you're spreading it out a little bit, loading things a little bit different, maybe strengthening all parts of it rather than overusing one particular part. But I know there's other perspectives on that as well in terms of it indicating instability and a lack of control. Here we were just looking at like inputting an average mechanical load, and so I guess there would be questions there on, should we be inputting the average? Should we be inputting like the peak that they typically experience? Maybe we're underestimating things here a little bit by not doing that. But I certainly think there's a benefit to subjecting the cartilage to a variety of mechanical loads and different forms of exercise, different types of mechanical loading, which I think is consistent with the whole cartilage conditioning idea. Get it used to sustaining a wide variety of loads early in life, especially.
Thank you.
Okay. David, please go ahead.
Hi there. First, fantastic talk. That was really engaging. But this question might be more in the minutia of the load cycle testing. And I was kind of curious how you determined what a proper failure was of the cartilage. Was it determined by like a partial tear, the beginning of one, or just a complete failure and rupture of the tissue?
Those were reference data from other studies, so I didn't do those experiments myself.
Right.
Typically in those studies, it's defined as, I guess, the first definition that you gave. So like plastic but partial failure of the tissue, not a complete rupture of it. Typically they'll look at like the strain response of the cartilage, and you'll typically see it creeping up a little bit in the early loading cycles, and then it kind of plateaus. And then something weird happens, right? Because it's been ripped or it's been ruptured partially, and that's typically where they would stop.
Right, that's where it's evaluated. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So 3 years ago in my candidates exam here in Calgary, there was a short discussion about the knee joint health related to knee joint loading. And then one of the examiners, I think Brent and Walter, they were all there, asked me about the expandable desk where we can work while we stand rather than just sitting. and then ask if the expandable desk is actually good for the knee joint health or not. And then I wasn't actually able to answer the question because there were too many thoughts in my mind. Like the loading magnitude itself is kind of small, it's relatively okay, but the duration of the loading is still long. So I'm just curious how you would actually think about the expandable desk related to the knee joint loading.
Anecdotally, I can run 50, 60 miles a week. I can do, 12 hours of triathlon training and my knees feel pretty good. At least, they might hurt a little bit during the run, but afterwards they feel okay. If I go to a museum in DC and stand up for half an hour, everything hurts, and I'm 40 years old now, so maybe that's the problem. But, my back hurts, my knee hurts, my feet hurts, everything hurts from standing. I'm a little biased here because I think standing all the time is a horrible idea. I think it's setting people up for long-term orthopedic issues, but there's a lot of major like public health bodies that have started to recommend essentially that, right? Stand as much as you can in the workplace, standing desktops in school for children and things like that. American Medical Association is recommending this. ACSM is recommending this. I don't know a whole lot about the standing literature and the static loading literature on cartilage. It's, that's not really what I study, and so I'm not as familiar with it as I probably should be. My understanding is that continual loading of cartilage promotes what's called wear-inducing lubrication modes, where basically you squeeze all the fluid out of the cartilage and keep it out of there for a long period of time. Whereas dynamic loading is, and the reason I think dynamic loading is probably good for cartilage is, remember early on when I was talking about how, yeah, it does have a blood supply, but it's indirect. It's through that synovial fluid that it's bathed in. And how do you get the old stuff out and cycle the new nutrients in if there's no veins there bringing it in? You got to load it, right? You got to squeeze it with a load, squeeze the old stuff out, remove that load, and let the new stuff come in. And so from that perspective, this type of loading is good for it. Whereas if you stand up and squish everything out for a long time, then it's lacking any nutrients for quite a while. I don't know, people don't stand for days at a time. They stand for minutes or for hours at a time. So is that long enough to actually damage it? I don't know, but it could be. So I'm being a little bit speculative there, but I think that's probably not the best type of load to be sustaining cartilage to for long periods of time.
Thank you. Benno, please go ahead.
If anyone studied that or knows that literature, please speak up. I don't really know it well.
Ross, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Now, you mostly spoke about mechanical load. And I always have the gut feeling that arthritis is much more a biochemical question than a mechanical question. What is your thought about that? That's the first question.
Sure.
The second question is, if I look at my colleagues, almost all of them stopped running after about 60, even Walter. Why is that? Is that more a muscle problem or is it more a mechanical problem?
On the first question, I would say osteoarthritis is very, very clearly not a disease purely of mechanics. And there's kind of debates on this in the literature, and I think people misinterpret it some of the time. Like nobody, no matter if you're a biologist or no matter if you're an engineer, nobody who has any idea what they're doing thinks that osteoarthritis is all biology and inflammation or all mechanical loading. But I think we can learn a lot about it by looking at it through those kind of exclusive lenses, right? Like if I assume it's all from mechanical loading and look at it through that lens, even if we know it's not all from mechanical loading, I think we can learn a lot about it that way. And similarly, from just assuming, oh, it's all from biology, it's all from inflammation, loading doesn't matter. That's obviously wrong, but I think we can learn a lot about it from that way.
Will you put some percentages on?
No. Obesity, I think, is the biggest demonstration of how it's beyond mechanical loading. So if you look at like prevalence of OA in different joints in obese adults, for knee OA, it's very high. There's some studies, but not all studies, but some saying their risk of hip OA is actually not particularly high. Nobody really gets ankle OA unless you have, chronic traumatic injuries to the ankle. And obese adults have a high risk of like hand and finger and wrist OA, which is not typically a weight-bearing joint. So clearly something much more complicated than just, oh, they're putting too much load on the joint. is going on. My other kind of pet theory on this is, and this will be a long answer, sorry. Running does carry a high risk of OA, as you probably know, in elite competitive runners, like former pro Olympic caliber marathon runners that do have a high risk of osteoarthritis.
Sorry, Ross, I think sorry, could you just go over once more?
Sure. Well, did you miss me?
I think I missed you, sorry.
Okay. Elite, like former pro competitive runners, like former Olympic caliber runners, they do have a high risk of knee osteoarthritis. And why is that? Is it because they're running 100 miles a week at elite speeds for 20 years? Maybe. But the other thing I wonder about them is maybe it's the biology. Maybe it's the non-mechanical stress, the circumstances under which the loading is accumulated. You know, like when I do a race or train for a race, it's for fun. It's my hobby, right? If the training goes bad or I race slow, big deal, life goes on. If I'm a pro, then my whole life is geared around that. I'm racing and training to race as a profession, as an occupation, with my financial livelihood and my reputation on the line, and in a sport that's not very financially lucrative except for the very best. Do all those stressors result in some sort of biological adaptation, some sort of inflammation that compromises the ability of the cartilage to sustain that really big mechanical load? Seems like it's possible. So I definitely think that it's absolutely a biology problem and a mechanics problem. How much of one, how much of the other, I couldn't say.
Okay.
I forgot what your second question was, Benno. Sorry. Can you say it again?
Why do people stop running? Sorry, do you hear me?
Yes.
Why do people stop running after 60 around? You know, all of the people that I knew that were runners don't run anymore.
I think I'd probably have to ask them, did you stop because your knee hurt, or did you stop because something else hurt? I have a pet theory that running injuries are actually good in terms of osteoarthritis. They stop us from training in stupid ways that might cause osteoarthritis in the long term. So they cause us to change our training a little bit and not damage the cartilage in the long term.
You don't think it's osteoarthritis?
I would speculate most of it's not osteoarthritis. For me personally, I've got another 20 years to go, but I just get kind of bored running 6 or 7 days a week now. I started doing triathlon stuff a couple of years ago, and I really got into that, and that to me is a lot more fun. So maybe they just get bored with running all the time and get interested in other stuff.
Okay, please, Tim, go ahead. Tim, if you are around.
Yeah, I am around. You cannot hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. It seems that the prediction from your model is that people that started running after the age of 20 have an increased risk of osteoarthritis because they didn't have the time to adapt.
Yep.
Did you search the literature to see if that's actually the case?
I have, and I haven't found much on it. There's very little on that topic. You see a lot on kind of the other way around, like lifetime runners versus not runners. I haven't found much on people that took up running later in life. There is a handful of training studies. There's a really good study at this, just the scope of and difficulty of doing the study still astounds me, by Van Ginkel in 2010, which was one of the only ones I've ever seen on like a training study in new runners who were well into adulthood, like people that were largely sedentary and were on an average age of like 30s. I think they ranged from like 20s to 40s, and started like a 2 or 3 month, like pretty easy running training program, and looked at adaptations to cartilage in that. And they did see some, and I'm forgetting the specific results, but they did see some adaptations there that seemed to be beneficial for the health of cartilage. So suggesting at least adaptations to things other than collagen could cause potentially positive changes there well into adulthood. That carbon dating study I was talking about a little bit, that was specifically about collagen. And so the caution that like, oh, you get to age 20-ish and that's all you've got, that's specific to collagen, which is a really important macromolecule, but it's not the only one in cartilage. There's other important ones, other things like proteoglycans and whatnot that are really important to its overall function. But the short answer to your question is, I don't know. I haven't seen a lot on like following people that start running in the middle of their life, and do they get osteoarthritis later on in life. The model suggests they'd have a higher risk for it, but I haven't seen those data.
You actually answered my second question, which was
okay.
about cartilage health is sort of related to collagen health. And I'm not a cartilage expert, but I know that there's all kinds of other things in cartilage. So
Sure.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there should be quite a lot of people that actually took up running after the age of 20, considering that running probably became way more popular over the last 40 years or so. So maybe it would be an interesting study to be done in the future.
The key there, I think, would be for people that take up running, say in middle age, what were their childhoods like? Did they play sports? Were they physically active, or have they been largely sedentary their entire life? I would speculate that if you compare two sedentary groups of middle-aged adults, one that was active as children and one that wasn't, you'd see a lower risk of OA in the ones that were active as children if they then took up running in middle age. At least that would be my hypothesis.
Yeah, interesting hypothesis. I'm curious to find out whether that's true.
We'll see.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, I see Brent, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick statement that we're going to extend the Q&A session beyond. We usually end at 4:15. We're going to extend that. I mean, people have to go 4:30, 4:45, whenever, go, feel free to leave. But just so everyone knows, we're going to give you time to get your questions in, and Ross is going to be around for a while.
I'm free all night.
But first of all, you need to do a study with gamers and just start making them run. But honestly, there's a group of underappreciated people that develop osteoarthritis. And it would be interesting for you to maybe study their mechanical loads. And that is postmenopausal females with osteoporosis or low bone mineral density. They make up almost 50%, at least in Canada, of individuals that develop osteoarthritis.
Okay.
I don't know if they have if they have higher medial joint compartment loads, like you showed I guess you showed lateral loads with the African American population, but It would be interesting. It's also an interesting model where you do know things are changing, at least underneath the cartilage with the bone, right? So it's a whole new level of something else that you could add to your model. And that's what happens when things underneath the bone change and remodel and whatnot. But I guess my real question is, there's got to be some preclinical evidence of this cartilage conditioning hypothesis, right? Like in rodent models or anything else, anything where you load cartilage during growth and development, and it ends up being tougher, stronger, more resilient in adulthood?
There are no studies in humans that I know of other than the Van Ginkel one, which was short term, just weeks, not months or years, a moderate amount of running, and an indirect image based index of cartilage health. They did some fMRI essentially on the cartilage. There's quite a bit of data on some different animal models, which is where in the study that I focus most of this on is where the plausible ranges of adaptations came from. Changes in the modulus, changes in the thickness, changes in the cortical bone shape and things like that. Some famous studies on beagles, where they had beagles running up to like 40 kilometers a day, which seems like a pretty large amount of running to me for a little beagle to be doing, and then examining their cartilage health in response to that. Moderate running was beneficial for it by different indices. Severe running was not so beneficial for it. There's some studies in horses suggesting the cartilage can adapt in the long term. There's some studies in rats suggesting the bone and the cartilage can adapt in the long term. So, and these are studies where they did not years, but if you cast it over the lifetime of an animal that doesn't live as long as a human, an appreciable fraction of its life spent loading the cartilage. So some evidence that this does have a basis in reality, that it can adapt positively if you do mechanical loading of it in high volumes and high intensities early in life.
Thanks.
Not in humans though.
Okay, Arash, please go ahead.
Since you talked about this high performance athletes, elite runners, one of the questions that always kind of puzzling about marathon running or long distance running is that most of successful athletes are quite short. 5'3", 5'4". And then I was wondering if it has anything to do with the fast growth spurt of taller people, that they can't be that much successful in long distance running.
I would say that's probably definitely a limiting factor in performance, and why you don't see a lot of elite marathon runners who are 6'2". You see a whole lot who are 5'5", 5'6", 5'7". Whether it would necessarily increase your risk of osteoarthritis or not, that I'm not sure of. But I think definitely possibly size a factor for performance for sure. More weight, more mass to move around, not really what you're looking for in a marathon race distance. But what if height as an independent factor for osteoarthritis in runners specifically, that I'm not sure that I would expect that.
So yeah, I was just wondering if because they have like taller people have faster growth spurt, maybe the body, specifically cartilage, can't keep up with that fast growing.
Could be. That's an intriguing idea. So maybe I don't know what the time scale of adaptation for cartilage is like, but does it outpace does it get outpaced by the time scale of increase in body weight and size and things like that? Could be. That's an interesting idea.
Thank you.
Walter, please go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations, Ross. You broke the attendance record.
Oh,
I saw that there were 99 people in the meeting here at one point. And that's
almost got to 100.
He invited all of his extended family.
That's by far,
yeah. My parents were probably
the most we ever had. I have several questions, but I'm just going to do one comment and one question.
Okay.
Because I see there's lots of other people. The one comment that I wanted to make is about the running, and being good or bad, and the elite runners not being so good. And two observations that we made recently in the lab. And the first one is that rats who we fed with high-fat sucrose diet, that then developed metabolic syndrome and became obese, and also developed knee osteoarthritis. When we had them running, their metabolic syndrome and their inflammation and also was essentially normalized, and they didn't develop knee osteoarthritis, despite the fact that they still gained weight and were a bit heavier and were a bit fatter in terms of body fat percentage compared to the control animals. So there it seemed that running did something good for the metabolism. On the other hand, we are just about to publish a study that we finish now, where we had mice run in a variety of ways, uphill, downhill, and lots and little, and also overtraining. And one group developed osteoarthritis, and it was the overtraining, the ones that we really ran hard up to 4 hours a day downhill. And those were also the animals that developed a metabolic profile that was very, very similar to obese people. So they had all these inflammatory markers upregulated locally and systemically. And so I wonder if when you run a lot as an elite marathon runner, if it's actually not the joint loading, but it might be that you're close to overtraining, and in fact, your metabolic state might be that of an obese person, or have some accents of that. So it's maybe something to keep in mind, that your inflammatory profile might potentially be adapted depending on how much you exercise. That's just as a comment. Then the question that I have is, in many of the animal models that we had, like post-traumatic animal models or unloading animal models, you were arguing that cartilage does not really adapt very much after you're 20. But I do know when you unload, either by fixing joints or by producing an injury where unloading is associated with that, then the cartilage and the cartilage properties change dramatically. And then when the animal gets back to normal loading and symmetric walking and running, the loading across the joint is actually very, very different, because now you have different cartilage. And I wonder if in the amputees that you have, it's not so much the unusual loading, but I assume that they are going to be unloaded after the injury for quite a while, I would assume that really does bad things to their cartilage. And then when they come back, they might potentially try to come back too fast. Sure. And there is not that. So I always think unloading is really bad, and unloading does change your cartilage, although loading or overloading might not really do very much to the cartilage properties.
That's definitely something I think is happening in the limb loss population. So like if from the day you have the injury until the day you're walking with anything approaching a normal mobility level with a prosthesis, which some of them never get to, that's years probably. And you probably have within there at least a period of months, maybe a full year, where you're very, very immobile and not moving and not loading the cartilage much at all. And it's for sure atrophying in that period, I'm sure. Well into adulthood, of course. There's also interesting connections there for obesity and osteoarthritis, I think. And there's interesting data on when obese people gain their weight. And you kind of think, well, they're just like steadily getting heavier and heavier. There's some studies showing that their weight is actually pretty stable for most of the year, except for then we have this period coming up here of the kind of the Western holiday season, you know, Halloween through New Year's, basically, where most people aren't so active and are also consuming a lot of high calorie foods. And so obese people tend to actually gain most of their annual weight in that period and are also kind of sedentary during that period. And so, and then maybe, oh, you get to New Year's and, oh, my resolution, now I'm going to exercise more. So maybe then they're starting to load the cartilage more when it's been atrophied a little bit from not doing much for the past few months. And maybe that's the biomechanics connection to osteoarthritis for obese folks. On your comment that on the results in the rats and the inflammation in the running, I find that extremely interesting. I think it ties into my point I made on all the different demographical risk factors and all the different populations that get osteoarthritis, that maybe it's the mechanical loading that links them. Well, maybe it's the other piece of this, and this ties back into Benno's question on inflammation too. Maybe it's the inflammatory profiles that makes, you know, an elite marathon runner in terms of risk for osteoarthritis similar to an obese person with limb loss. You know, what do they have in common? Well, not much, obviously, but maybe they have similar inflammatory profiles, and that's why they're both getting osteoarthritis.
Great, thanks a lot, Ross.
Okay, Colin, please go ahead.
Hi, Colin.
Hey, Ross, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. So my question is more related to your the fatigue life model you're using for the cartilage. So my life right now has been completely about tendon fatigue life. I've been testing cadaveric human patellar tendon, so I'm super familiar with this relationship and stuff. But what we're finding is sometimes at least for the human patellar tendon, we're seeing the stress is explaining a little bit more variance compared to the strain. Okay. But I know with Achilles tendon, with Ren's work back in 2003, she was finding kind of that strain was explaining a little bit better than stress. And I noticed that you didn't actually, I'm not sure if I missed it, but I didn't see that you reported the relationship with strain and fatigue life. So is it similar to the one that you were showing with stress, or is it a little worse? How does it look?
It looks similar. So the stress strain relationship is, of course, nonlinear eventually, yeah. But in the range of the loads in that data set in that Ryman Schneider paper, it was pretty linear for most of them. So we actually parameterized the model with a strain life relationship. So I took their stresses and converted them to strains with the material properties that were in that paper, and then use the strains to actually, you know, estimate the probability and the rest of the business of it. The reason we ended up using strains is because, and one of the reviewers brought this up on that paper, which I thought was a really important point. For adaptation, you get really weird results if it's a stress-driven model, where making the cartilage thicker and making the cartilage stiffer doesn't necessarily benefit you in terms of reducing stress. It'll benefit you for reducing strain. And so that was ultimately why we chose to make it a strain-driven model, is that making it a stress-driven model, then the adaptations you needed to actually have running be okay for your joints didn't make any sense. Like it had to just have really weird magnitudes and directions of changes in the material properties to get it to do that.
Right, okay. And maybe just a quick follow-up. in the paper that Brent and I wrote about Achilles tendon cumulative damage and stuff, we were taking into account the time that the actual tendon was under load, because that had a small effect in some of the data that had been published for fatigue life of tendon. Do you think that a similar effect exists for cartilage, and would you like, do you think implementing it would make sense, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. It ties back into, I think, Sungwon's question about standing. You know, eventually
Yeah.
you load it for too long of a period where this is bad for it. So is there a difference between, you know, 6 megapascals for 100 milliseconds versus 6 megapascals for 1,000 milliseconds? Yeah, for sure. That's going to have different effects on, I think, on the mechanical response of cartilage and the eventual health of the cartilage. Brent and I have talked about this various times in the past on how, like, essentially all of the data on fatigue life of human cartilage in most tissues is expressed in terms of peak stress. And they sometimes control for, like, you know, the things you're talking about, you know, duty cycle and loading rate and whatnot. I'm not sure you can strictly control for all of those things and only have like peak stress be the only thing that's different. But so maybe, you know, is it a combination of these things? You know, we kind of assume it's a function of the peak, whatever, you know, the peak load, peak stress, peak strain. But that's not changing in isolation, right? Maybe it's actually being driven by a combination of things, or by something else that the peak stress just correlates with. So I don't know, but great question.
Thanks.
Okay, on that note, I would like to thank Ross again for sharing his great work. For the next week's seminar, we'll be hearing from Colin Ferminger, and the title of his talk is Effects of Cyclic Loading on the Mechanical Property, Degradation, and Fatigue Behavior on Human Patellar Tendon. Thank you for coming today, and I'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Ross.
Thank
you
you,
very
Ross.
much, Ross, and thank you from all the people around the world there. I'm seeing lots of people that I haven't seen in a long time, so welcome to the seminar. Thank you, Sungwon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Sungwon. Okay, Ross, I'll see you on the, well, if other people want to chat with you for a few minutes, go ahead, but come meet me on the other Zoom link in a minute.
Okay, I can stick around for a minute if anyone has any other questions.
I think Bagley had a question for you.
Yeah, I have a question for
Taking
you.
off though.
Hey, Mike.
Thanks for the talk.
Welcome, thank you.
It was really nice. I was wondering if you had any insights into why people don't get ankle OA, despite the fact that the forces are so much higher. Do you think this supports your idea of cartilage conditioning?
Ankle OA is fascinating to me, and like I was mentioning with the obese adults, the difference in prevalence between the joints is super interesting, and to me is really unexplained. Like knee OA, it's sky high for lots of people. Hip OA is all over the place, and nobody, unless they sprain the ankle all the time, has a high risk of ankle OA. I don't know ankle OA super well, but that's just kind of my general read on it. Is it's a much lower prevalence for like non-traumatic ankle OA than knee or than hip. So some of the Seedham studies, and this was kind of one of his original things that he was pointing out, was the modulus and some of the other material properties, maybe the thickness of the cartilage sort of correlates with this. Like if you look at, you know, knee is the most high risk, and then hip is in the middle, and then ankle's lower, seems to kind of correlate with the material properties of the cartilage, which isn't directly showing adaptation, but maybe, you know, maybe everyone starts out with it all being identical, and then ankle gets thicker and stronger over life because it's adapting more than the others. So that's pretty much all I've got on that. I think it's a really fascinating question. That's
kind of what I was wondering. It does kind of make sense that the mechanical properties should differ if the forces are, you know, like ankle contact force is like 4 body weights higher than the knee. It's huge. So, and then the other question is, why don't people who get PFP get PFOA if they're both, like, you know, thought to be kind of these? I don't know what the deal is with either PFP or PFOA, but
sure,
you always hear that they're both load-induced kind of injuries.
Sure. I'm not touching pain. I know nothing about pain. Pain is super interesting and complicated. Like healthy cartilage has no innervations, right? And that's why I can, you know, jump up and down on one leg and my foot hurts, but my knee doesn't hurt. Osteoarthritic cartilage does sometimes develop like direct innervations to the cartilage that then do sense pain. I assume it's some sort of protective or defensive mechanism. And so you do sometimes see changes there with pathology that might make it a painful condition, when in a healthy state it's not painful. But I don't think I know the patellofemoral OA or, you know, running injury literature well enough to speculate on that.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, Rosa, I leave. Thank you very much. It's
Thanks, Benno. Great to see you.
fantastic.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you, Ross, again.
You're welcome. I'm gonna hop off here and get on the other
Yep.
events students. So thanks. Take
Yep.
care.
Thanks.
Bye.